the honor to present Mr. John Chowning. But he's a pioneer, really pioneer of computer music. He started since 1964 with Mathew in the Bell Laboratories, the famous Bell Laboratories, working music with computers. And he's very famous as inventor of the FM synthesis, a system that was in 1967, a system that can produce very interesting sounds with only 2 or 3 generators instead of many generators that was needed before with additive synthesis. And he was working in Stanford University, and there's a legend, I don't know if it's true or not, that Stanford University said that it was too expensive for this research with FM synthesis, etc. And maybe Mr. Chowning will have to move from the university. But a few years later, FM synthesis was sold to Yamaha, and Stanford got a lot of money and said, okay, you can stay in the next 12 months. And he also the co-founder of the famous Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics in Stanford, 1975, where we stole also the name. So in Greece, there is 74. We stole the name in Greece for the Institute for Research in Music and Acoustics. Mr. Chowning, please. Thank you.
So I thank the faculty and institutions that have invited us here. It's a great honor to be able to speak to colleagues in such a distinguished environment and the kind of the face of antiquity, Athens, Greece. Wow. So I thank you all, and a special bit of gratitude to Anastasia for giving me permission to indulge in a bit of personal history. It was 50 years ago that I made our first computer-generated sounds at Stanford. 50 years ago. It's now 11, that's about 10 hours before. It could have been this very moment. I can't remember, I didn't keep lab notes because I had no training as a scientist or any engineering. So I just did my work, never believing in much further than the dream that I was chasing. That the combined work of Max and Chowning, Euclid, and myself and many others was not seen then by many of our colleagues not working in the area as a very promising field. I was told, for example, this is the dehumanization of music. So it was also 40 years ago. Okay, so that was 50 years ago. Maybe this moment, I don't know. But it's a special moment for me. 40 years ago, we founded Karma. And Karma became and remains an absolutely superb place, and I'll say a few words at the end of this presentation about Karma. And it's also 80 years ago that I began life on this planet, which I hope that your generations take better care of than did mine. So there's a lot to celebrate, and I'm really happy to be here. In his seminal paper that set music on a new path, Mathew wrote in 1963, there are no theoretical limitations to the performance of the computer as a source of musical sounds, in contrast to the performance of ordinary instruments. At present, the range of computer music is limited principally by cost and by our knowledge of psychoacoustics. These limits are rapidly receding. But I was well aware that in the 1960s, access to complex studios, meeting the stringent technical requirements, acquiring the specialized knowledge and technical skills, placed such desires beyond those that I had, beyond the reach of all of the most well-established composers. Democratization of resources only. Mack's paper had been given to me because I had expressed an interest in electroacoustic music to a fellow percussionist in the Stanford Symphony. Joan Mansour, a biologist by training, who read scientific journals, gave me Mathew's article in January 1964. I was the timpanist. Joan was a percussionist. We had many conversations during movement-long rests that percussionists wait through in symphonic music, and she remembered my having expressed an interest in music that was created for loudspeakers. I had never read science before. I was a composer. I read about and studied music, so having Mathew's article in hand, given to me by this thoughtful colleague, was a bit of serendipity that changed my life. Max then goes on to describe how numbers become sound. How can the numbers with which a computer deals be converted into sounds the ears can hear? Remember, we didn't know in these years anything about sampling, so you have to sort of clean your brains to be able to understand what a test really this was. The most general conversion is based upon the use of numbers as sampling of the sound pressure wave. A sequence of numbers from the computer is put into an analog to digital converter. He really meant digital to analog converter, which generates a sequence of electric pulses whose amplitudes are proportional to the numbers. These pulses are smoothed with a filter and then converted to a sound wave by means of an ordinary loudspeaker. Intuitively, we feel that if a high enough pulse rate is used and the amplitudes of the pulses are generated with sufficient precision, then any sound can be closely approximated by this process. Mathematically, it has been established that this conclusion is correct. Here are the references in Max's article. Note the first one. We must remember that for decades, Bell Telephone Laboratories harbored the greatest concentration of scientific and engineering brainpower on Earth. And Claude Shannon's 1948 paper, Mathematical Theory of Communication, is the hard-edged theory that underlies the flow of information in today's complex digital world of computers, mobile devices, capable of sensing sound, image, touch, location, complex machines, the complete understanding of which is beyond the capacity to know of any single human being. Shannon's paper is a summation of his own work and that of his colleagues and predecessors. The timing was propitious, as the first stored program computers were just being developed. The paper includes the first use of the word bits. Shannon writes, quote, if the base 2 is used, the resulting units may be called binary digits, or more briefly, bits, a word suggested by J.W. Tukey, his colleague. He was a colleague at ETL. And theorem 13, the sampling theorem, is critical to the connection between continuous and discrete signals. In his article, 50 years later, The Origins of the Sampling Theorem, H.D. Luke traces the rich history of the sampling theorem. He says, in 1948 and 1949, Claude E. Shannon published the two revolutionary papers in which he founded the information theory. In the sampling theorem is formulated as theorem 13. Luke then traces the history of the contributions of the sampling theorem, noting that the first experiments with time division multiplexing were in 1848. He then concludes, the sampling theorem for low-pass functions plays an important role in communication engineering as a connecting link between continuous time and discrete time sequence. The numerous different names to which the sampling theorem is attributed in the literature, Chowning, Nyquist, Kotelnikov, Whittaker, and Sumeya, gave rise to the above discussion of its origins. However, this history also reveals a process which is often apparent in theoretical problems in technology or physics. First, the practitioners put forward a rule of thumb. Then the theoreticians develop the general solution. And finally, someone discovers that the mathematicians have long since solved the mathematical problem which it contains, but in splendid isolation. So that's a nice article. I think it ought to be included in our growing history, and because it explains the richness that preceded Shannon's work and makes a contribution to those who helped set it up. The sampling theorem is the foundation on which Mathew based much of his early work. His research included speech, hearing, psychoacoustics, and computer music, where the loudspeaker is the ultimate sound source. Mathew's Figure 1, a diagrammatic representation of the sampling theorem, opened the door to my understanding of what was otherwise incomprehensible because of my own nothing but music background. It presented a comprehensible face of the sampling theorem, which for me, and perhaps others, was suggestive and inspiring, even poetic in that it showed a path to electroacoustic music that bypassed for me what was technological clutter, a path that would allow the composition of any perceivable sound, as he wrote, bringing musical creation to the edge of my imagination. So without that theorem, I would not be here. Of this diagram, I'm absolutely certain I would not be here. I would be a tugboat captain, maybe in San Francisco Bay, but I would not be here. Part of Max's genius, his representation. Immediately striking in the diagram is that there are but 3 devices and a computer, none of which have changed over time in their functional relationship, but all of which have changed over time in their cost, quality, and precision for the better. Now, dear colleagues, imagine me, a 29-year-old graduate student, 15 years from his last math class, never having seen a computer, but with vivid imaginings, however vague and decoded, of composing music in space. Imagine further the conceptual breakthrough when, with images in mind of electroacoustic music studios, filled with electronic equipment, cables, wires, multiple microphones, spinning loudspeakers, and stern-looking engineers in bright coats. Imagine what I understood the implications of Max Mathew's Figure 1. I then discovered Stanford's early and strong commitment to computing. In the spring quarter of 1964, I began the journey of learning to program from Professor George Forsythe, who taught a computer programming course for non-engineering students. In the summer of 1964, I visited Max at Bell Labs in New Jersey. He emphasized the importance of psychoacoustics and explained to me what I would have to do in order to run this program at Stanford. He gave me the program in the form of a box of punched cards. Don't drop the cards. In his article, Max continued, in this article, Max continues. Let's see. I had to learn to program. He said, there are no theoretical limitations to the performance of the computer as a source of musical sound, which I have read. Okay. He said, at present, the range of computer music is limited principally by cost. This is Max, standing in front of this IBM 7094, 1969. So Max, to whom we owe so much, died in April 2011. We miss him. So that computer had 32,036 bit words, about 150 kilobytes of core memory. Now, 7 years I gave a talk to ICMC, and I presented the same data. 7 years in 2007. In 2011, 4 years ago, this part the same. Permanent memory, magnetic tape drives, lots in Max's computer. Footprint was huge, but all the tape drives and central processing units would have filled half the area of this room. The cost, this is from IBM Technical Literature, 1960. The IBM 7090, which is manufactured at IBM's Poughkeepsie, New York, sells for $2,800,000. Basically, no frills. And rents for $63,500 a month in a typical configuration. Really, $2.8 million. Democratization of resources? Well, wait. The computer before me, MacBook Pro Vintage 2011, 4 gigabytes of memory, 250 gigabytes of disk storage, 2.3 gigahertz clock, footprint about a tenth of a meter, cost about $2,500. So the relative cost of computing, 1960 to 2011, based upon cost of memory, which in the 1960s was by far the most expensive part of a computer, or memory with iron donuts, carefully sewn with 4 wires and all kinds of that. So 150 kilobytes versus 4 gigabytes, about $20 versus 63 cents times 10 to the minus 6. Value of IBM 7090 in 2011, 9 cents. So the steel cases would be worth a fortune today. But here's the one that's so stunning. The value of this one, 1967. Okay, this is a 2011 and 50 cents. This is a 2011 computer. And subsequently I've upgraded, and now I have 16 gigabytes of memory and semiconductor memory. And this is like 4 times. So we're in the trillions now, the value of such a computer. All right, now to my other side of the Stanford Orchestra was the tuba player. It was a very good one. Tuba players also have lots of breasts in symphonic music, so we too had opportunities to talk. But we did not talk about computers. In fact, I did not know anything about David Poole's academic interests except that he was a math major. We talked about music, folk art, sailing, but we never talked about computers. So when I returned from Bell Labs in September of 1964, standing with a box of punch cards in my hand, in the Stanford Computer Center. It was a great surprise and my good fortune to meet David, whom I had known since 1.5 years as a tuba player. David knew a lot about computers. He thought for a day or so about Max's article and figured out that it was possible to implement Max's music synthesis system, the sound samples were written by the IBM 7090, similar to this 7094 with Max. To a large capacity disk drive of 28 megabytes, which was shared with John McCarthy's time-shared PDP-1 computer. The samples were read from the disk and then displayed on the PDP-1 CRT, whose XY deflected ladders provided high-quality digital to analog conversion, an online computer music system, perhaps the first, and this was luxurious. Over the next 2 years, David worked on finishing his degree while tutoring me in those aspects of computer technology that I needed to know. He became a critical systems engineer for John McCarthy's Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, on whose computer our music was dependent. David Poole was my angel. He programmed the PDP-1 IBM 7090 Music 4 system. He tutored Chowning. He wrote the PDP-10 assembly language version of Music 4, taught me how to write, and Fortran and I wrote the function generators in Fortran. He taught Chowning and Leland Smith, my composition teacher and then colleague. He designed with Phil Pettit and built the Fundi computers. The F1, the Super Fundi F1 was used for the animation process in Tron in 1982, now a cult film. And it was the fastest PDP-10 that it was ever made. He also built for us he built the F2 and 4 Karma, the F4 in 1978. From the very beginning, I worked on the simulation of moving sound sources as auditory illusions, looking for books and papers having to do with sound localization, our perception of sound in space. I found that what was published was mostly in small specialized libraries, in the Department of Speech and Hearing Sciences, in the School of Medicine. The domain of Professor Earl Schubert. The guidance he provided me in those years was later extended to numbers of other Karma students. After retiring from the medical school, Schubert maintained a close contact with Karma through the rest of his life. Little was known, especially about our perception of distance. Is a sound close or far? What is the auditory equivalent to perspective and vision? There was lots of information about our perception of angle, as it was so important to the stereo image in still evolving acetate LP recordings. However, distance, the loop information came for free. It was in the microphones. So there was little about distance. On a visit to Bell Labs, Max asked me to participate in an experiment at the Bell Labs chamber. I remember little about the experiment, but I remember sensing that reverberation must be an important component in distance perception, and having David Poole's synthesis program allowed me to test my ideas. This was the quad space, with the channels named according to the Cartesian coordinates. The listener space was within the perimeters of the quad space, the illusory sound space outside the perimeter. Programming made it possible for me to find by graphic means the trajectory and velocity for a moving sound source. A mathematician said I should use vector algebra, and I didn't know anything about vector algebra, but I could see that plotting points at a constant rate in space would give me the information that I needed. So a source has azimuth, has distance, it moves, so within the path, the successive radii is captured velocity, radial velocity, and the angular velocity is a function of angular displacement. So spatialization, there was no precise idea of terrainless when I began in 1964. I wanted to free sound from the loudspeakers, but I had no idea as to perform the sound of the tape, that is the musical form. The discovery of FM synthesis in 1967 provided the means to composing the sound itself, or from the inside out, as we often say. Brancusi's sculpture was inspiring and implicative, and the work of MC Escher, especially Metamorphosis 3, had entered the common culture of the day. Both would find analogies in my first two works, Sabelith and Turinus. Sabelith was composed as a testbed for the more complex piece that would soon follow. Learning to program a computer would prove to be the single most important newly acquired skill. So here's an example of a sound moving in a circular path. That's the path, and here's the sound example. So the Doppler shift is evidently important. I puzzled over why this function was not symmetrical, and with a little thought experiment, sound moving at the speed of sound, it's pretty easy to see that it approaches infinitely high until it reaches the sonic boom, but going away from the listener, it's only 1 octave lower. Okay, so then I wrote Fortran programs, the control functions for spatial illusion, as shown here. So a source moving around the space, my program calculated the azimuth, or channel intensity control, the distance, the Doppler shift, and the amplitude of the direct signal, and the amplitude of the reverberant signal. Of course, any trajectory image can be computed. So this is the diagram of the computer program that I wrote to produce these illusions in 1968. I've highlighted the signal flow and control. I had discovered FM synthesis the year before, so this is a culmination of all that I had learned since beginning in 1964. This was a very important moment in my personal history and in the direction that the Computer Music Project, and eventually Karma, would take for several reasons. While computers were not yet powerful enough to synthesize and process sound in real time, hands-on, favoring immediate response, they would be someday. Witness the computer that I am using. But the computer brought to music something else. Computer synthesis provided the composer direct control of the material of music as a painter has paint with canvas. I also realized that computer programming allowed us to accomplish two very different but complementary tasks, joining the structure of the sound itself to the structure of musical form. And I have some nice examples of Jean-Claude work of my own in a few minutes, and John Hirsch that will demonstrate that. I also understood the importance of diverse disciplines in the population of researchers, like the artificial intelligence lab, computer scientists, electrical engineers, of course, but there were also other disciplines, a philosopher, linguist, a physicist, and a psychiatrist. We in the Computer Music Project were, in a sense, students, and we found in these colleagues patient teachers who willingly answered our questions as they watched us build a new means for making and representing music. Less earnest, the AI Lab's able and imaginative administrator researcher protected our limited access to the AI Lab system, reminding the funded researchers who complained about all the computer cycles we got on a time-share system. The reason we logged so many computer cycles was because we had little competition at 3 o'clock in the morning. So we worked on weekends and when we had the right to work after midnight. So there were few of the funded researchers, and so we got most of the, virtually all the computer cycles. Finally, I realized my ears were my most important tool. But those having motivation and perseverance, but no special competence in building electronic devices, were presented with the means to engage in a medium and a high level of abstraction that was a defining musical advance in the 20th century, music composed for loudspeakers. While exploring curvilinear possibilities with a light pen, and an AI lab researcher remarked that the image looked like a listener figure. Another serendipitous event, as I then learned about listener, his figures, and this wonderful misapplication of his work as using Tyrannus, a work from 1972 that represents all I knew at that time after 8 years of development and study. So I have to show. So there's a graphic that goes, okay, maybe, but all right. So play that again. This one. So what's special about the vicissitude as a sound pattern? Intrinsic to the vicissitude figure is acceleration and deceleration as a function of the change of slope and sine and cosine functions. So now we're going to watch an arrow compared with the arrow with the moving along the path at a constant rate with the vicissitude pattern, which is the Euclid line. So you'll see that the vicissitude figure deaccelerates and then reaccelerates after change of direction, much like any physical mass in motion in the real world. So arrows ahead. Now the listener catches up. The arrows ahead. And they end up at the same time. Okay. Well, it's a small detail in creating these patterns. Jean-Claude and I have always believed that spending a lot of time on these details has ultimately a great payoff, because we learn a lot in tending to detail. Okay, so now I'll show you some more detail. Click on this, open it, and show you back the way. Okay, so I couldn't play that from. All right, so what do we mean by loudness? We use the term loudness to mean intensity as we turn down the end to loud. Loudness of musical dynamic, or basically synonymous. The common meaning of music played louder is unambiguous. An increase in musical dynamics, pianissimo, fortissimo, is associated with effort, bow pressure, velocities, air pressure, strike force. In all of these cases, there is an increase in bandwidth and or centroid of the spectrum with an increase in effort or dynamic and loudness. So this is an example of casting in physical space in subjective space. So in vertical axis, we have loudness. On the horizontal x-axis, we have pitch height. And we have distance. So the physical representation, characterization of a tone at a fortissimo in the foreground, proximity to the listener, compared to one in distance, is simply a change in overall intensity. A change in effort or musical dynamic means the centroid decreases and typically the bandwidth decreases. So there's less energy to the partials of the signal. Now let's listen to one. We add the dimension of time, so now we have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 6-dimensional space. Nested, one nested in within the other. So. Okay. The only change is one overall intensity and the fact that the reverberation does not change in intensity, because the source is putting the same amount of reverber energy into the room. All that changes is the direct signal, which is the inverse square law, from the listener to the source. Now, decrease in effort or loudness, subjective. Okay, once more. Centroid goes towards the lower partials, and the bandwidth increases. So now let's compare the last tone of each set. So we hear soft tone that's soft and near, followed by a tone that's loud and far. Pretty nuanced, but it's a powerful control over loudness. Something other than turning gains on amplifiers. One more sequence, the soft and near becoming soft and far. Okay, so this image represents my conception of loudness in 1971-72, although the animation I made, I think, in 2005 or something. And of all these animations, this was the most complicated, I think. Discovery of FM synthesis. In November '67, I was fully engaged in refinement of the perceptual cues related to spatial illusions of sounds in space. Intuitively, I knew that the saliency of the distance cue was dependent on finding ways to create internal dynamism of computer sounds. And Brisset's timbres were not known to me. My work in spatialization was dependent upon reverberation for the distance cue, as demonstrated above. Reverberation revealed the distance of the sound most noticeably when there was a change in frequency of the sound, such as portamento or vibrato, because of the phase complexity from the feedback paths. That is, when the direct signal was easily distinguished from the reverberant signal. Experimenting with vibrato rates and depths, I increased both, producing sounds having abundance of frequency variation. At a certain point, I passed the threshold where the change was no longer heard as one of instantaneous frequency. I had passed from the time domain to the frequency domain. With two oscillators, I had produced a dynamic change in spectrum, and I paid attention. It was a discovery of the year, so I want that to be clear. I knew nothing about the mathematics when this occurred. I did write down the data. Jean-Claude fortunately recorded the date that I showed him in December 18, 1967, and I remember that it was maybe 7 weeks before. So this was the kind of music 5, music 4 style patch that was used. Perfectly simple patch. The only condition is that the pointer could move backward as well as forward to the sign table, which was a change in the line of code, making the increment to the sign table pay attention to the sign. And so the arrow could move both directions as it addressed the sign table. So we call this a negative increment oscillator. And so there's the equation, of course, which I did not understand, but when shown to me by an engineer, He explained how the trigonometric expansion determined by the decimal coefficients, the position and amplitude of the frequencies. Okay, so here are some of those early tones. A percussive tone. Brass tones, brass tone. And they had the characteristic that Euclid explained to me during the onset of the brass tone. There's a rapid increase in the number of harmonics. So the harmonics are key to increased intensity. And it's a little complicated. So it's not linear through all harmonics. And the FM sweep through the modulation index from 0 to, say, 3 or 4 in this case, produces a kind of complexity that seemed to be appropriate to the sound that you hear in this example. So in 1971, I think I made these, and I wrote a little canon. So John McCarthy, who was, I would say, not very sophisticated musically, asked me what a canon was. So I said, well, he said, oh, you mean like row, row, row your boat? I said, yes. Or Frere Jacques? I said, yes. So somewhere we have a version of Frere Jacques under these blessings. And he was happy. I was too, because he allowed us to stay in as users of our users of his system. Then so these were all well known academically, but I am going to make one quick point about the theory. So there we have an index of 1. Those are the side bands that are created. This is straight out of the electrical engineering text. And this shows how the coefficients determine the amplitude. And so in the representation, the designers of that article, I think it was Turner, ignored the sign function, or the negative sign in lower side bands. But it turns out for explaining synthesis, FM synthesis, those signs are important, and this is why. It sounds the same, but if we now change the carrier frequency from 500 hertz to 100 hertz, and account for the fact that the lower frequencies that are negative, lower than 0 hertz, are the same as positive frequencies with a change of sign, then look what happens. We get algebraic sum, so it changes the components' amplitudes, and we take the magnitude of the spectrum. That's what it says. Okay. So there's this issue that everyone has faced of why do sounds not kind of look like what they should look like. It's because we have to account for the fact that tones that reflect around 0, if the components fall on existing components, then we have to flip the sign and take the algebraic sum. In harmonic spectra, saying there's this points to the fact that this harmonicity factor, which is in the Maximus P world, and perhaps elsewhere, the harmonicity factor, they say, if the modulator to carrier ratio is an integer, we will result in the harmonic series. Well, that's not wrong, it's just misleading. because here we have a carrier at 5 times the modulating frequency, so the harmonicity factor would be 0.2, yet it's in the harmonic series and we have no pitch ambiguity at all. Okay, we listen to it again. And now move the carrier down to 100 hertz. Change the modulating frequency from 100 to something close to the golden ratio. Now, the negative frequency components flip with the sign, the change in sign, and we take the magnitude of the spectrum. So we have inharmonic portions. All right, so it's 12:03. We started 20 minutes late, didn't we? Okay. So here's how it works, dynamic spectrum. That's how one component changes through time. So the carrier component. So we're sweeping through the indices. Now, all the components for a modulation index from 0 to 4. So the value in Yamaha picked up on the idea of implementing this version of this synthesizer had to do with the processors being very efficient, memory is few, small, just a few stored functions, sine wave and piecewise linear envelopes, and aliasing, because aliasing could be controlled by making index decrease as a function of pitch height. Computationally, it was an advantage. Musically, few perceptually salient parameters, time-varying dynamic spectra, harmonic and inharmonic spectra. The simple coupling of intensity, bandwidth, and or center of mass of the spectrum. Okay, this is a famous quote. Dans les champs de l'observation, le hasard nous favorise ce que les esprits préparés, commonly translated as chance favors the prepared mind. But the real translation is, in the fields of observation, chance favors only the prepared mind. So the question was my mind idea. Well, it certainly wasn't in the traditional sense. I mean, I was perhaps the least likely person to exploit this, but I was naive, and maybe there should be a footnote to Pasteur's famous statement, which says, sometimes if you're curious like a child and know nothing at all, you don't have a preset understanding of what should be and what can be. So the physics and engineering world think of a modulated, frequent modulated waveform as being unintelligible. You have to have a demodulator, which is our radio. So anyway, in 1975, the EarCom team visited Stanford's Carmel for a course in computer music. I was asked to compose a piece for EarCom's concert series. I completed Strio in 1977, work that I had begun working on several years before. Pierre Boulez brought EarCom team to Carmel. After having met me at BBC Orchestra in London, together with Jean-Claude Bisset, we convinced him to abandon many of the technologies that were being planned in favor of the digital domain. But most importantly, we convinced him that he should appoint Max Mathews as his scientific advisor. Max immediately recommended that the entire EarCom come to Stanford for an intensive 2-week course in computers and music. So there's Pierre Boulez at the console with a light pen, the same one 3 or 4 years earlier I used to draw curves that I was convinced to change into distribute patterns. Then Andy Moore, myself, Max Mathews, and Steve Martin a graduate student at the time. Now, Euclid's line. So this is how we describe the golden ratio, and algebraically. But Euclid, of course, did it by geometric means. And I've looked at this equation, and I can't imagine going backwards from that to Euclid's original explanation. I would not have any idea how that could be done. But I can imagine going the other way. So it's, the way he explained in two different forms, in book 3, I think, and I forget what it was, but it was incredibly enlightening to me that one can understand this incredibly important equation by simple means of logic and managing lines and lengths. The ratio of the sequential elements of the Fibonacci sequence approach the golden ratio asymptotically. The Fibonacci sequence where each number is the sum of the previous two, but I think we all know this, so I'm going to go to this point. Integer powers of phi are similarly related by sums to the previous two. I myself discovered this when I was in Berlin for a year. I'm sure that many mathematicians know that there's this relationship. But I discovered it in looking at FM sidebands and looking for numbers that would produce inharmonic spectra that were different but rich like the square root of 2. Pi is not a good one because 3.1 is too close to 3, so it sounds like out of tune, 3-to-1 ratio. But the golden ratio then came to me as a near discovery. And then I looked at the background and some of the theory that surrounds it and discovered this use. There we have powers of the golden ratio. The spectrum made of character modulating ratios, which are also powers of the golden ratio. Inharmonic partials, but ordered, not chaotic. We compare that to, we compare that to harmonic series and common practice tuning. I've scrambled my slides, I'm sure, sorry. So let me... Temperate tuning beats. Just tuning. Now, divisions of 8. This is Pearson's 8-tone canon. Odd with odd, even with even. It's not good music, but the idea is a very rich idea. And it's stimulated, as I remember, SPRIA, the idea of spectral space and complementary tuning space. So, harmonics, inharmonic partials, based upon powers of the golden ratio, change one of the ratios of this of the FM formula, and we have still common partials. Small offset produces beats. And this, a little bit as it was composed in Strio. So the thing that John Pierce and Max too didn't know how to do was to compose the ideas that they came upon. Their ideas were incredibly rich in every one of these sort of cartoon-like events and examples from the from the early 60s. You can find a powerful idea like the international lullaby, or metamorphosis of melody from one to another, or his little tune, kind of cartoon tune that elucidates loudness. Vibrato can be important loudness. This is the structure of Strio. And now I'm going to play the most astounding, for me, example that I can imagine almost since I wrote Strio. I often wondered whether it worked because it just happens to work with golden ratio tunings. This is an example of a synthesized block chorale, without artifice, where the tones are composed of partials produced by individual oscillators, the amplitudes of which are similar to those of a sawtooth wave. It's not a sawtooth wave, and could not be. The chorale is presented 4 times, where each iteration sounds a different relationship of tones and tuning. The spectral tuning renderings of the chorale are represented by a tone having a pitch frequency of 110 Hz. Where the red-colored equation, that one, and division along the x-axis stand for the pitch space scale, common practice scale. The gray equation, that one, series and common practice tuning. Okay. I would say this is synth 4, right? We all know that. Okay, now the base of the pitch equation is increased by 10% to 2.1. So imagine what this would sound like. Okay, so now the third harmonic is at about the little less than the 7th degree of the octave. Okay. Now we restore the pitch base to the base to 2. Now we change the spectral space to 2.1. So then all the harmonics are stretched by 10%. So now they're inharmonic partials. So what will this sound like? So those were not surprising to me. I created the graphic along with this simply because in doing the graphic I confirmed that what I think I was hearing is really what I was hearing. Now, what if we changed them both? 10 more, did you say? Yeah. Oh, we're out of time. I knew that. So now look what happens. So we stretch both. So the second harmonic stays with the octave, like that. retain their position in relationship to the pitch space. It sounds better than, or as good as. So I'm going to let this run a little bit so that it gets into the, you'll hear that even the minor it sounds. This is a citation which I have just begun looking at. Citharis, who's a mathematician, I think, at the University of Minnesota, tuning timbre spectrum scale. The examples that I played just now, this chorale, I asked Tom Rossing last week before he came to track down who actually made it and why. So it was Adrian Boetsma, a Dutch acoustician, I think now at Georgia Tech. And the reason he did it, because in the booklet describing these audio demonstrations, there's a little said, he did it because of John Pierce's 8-tone scale. He wanted to see if what was implied was indeed true. So, those were some of the tones that I guess I want to move to. I have to go further, sorry. And just 1 second. And this lecture will be continued in the future. Tell you what, I'll leave this slide set with you. People who were involved at Karma. And as you can tell, the whole presentation was really making attribution to the environment in which we learned all the things beginning from zero that I learned not because I'm brilliant, but because I persevered and found the people who had the answers to the questions that I needed to have. And so the point, I guess, that I would like to leave with all of you is that what we do is a lot bigger than ourselves, and paying tribute to those who helped us along the beginning with Max and my angel David is important. So, yeah, keep going.
Thank you very much, really. We could hear you for hours. We have the temperature of the program.
Thank you very much, John, and for this historical speech. After 50 years of computer music, I would like just to inform you that this afternoon there will be a satellite event at the Academy of Plato, and the bus will leave from here at 4:30. But if you want to go there by taxi, you can go, and we can ask the registration desk about the address at 6:30. So there, John Chowning, John Rodriguez, and all the invited and keynote speakers are going to make a tribute to Plato and visit this archaeological site. After, I would like, first of all, on behalf of the organizing committee,